Hello and welcome to Clean Talk. I'm your host, Brad Whitchurch, and we're coming to you live from the beautiful Seal Shield Studios in downtown Orlando, Florida. Very excited for my guest today, an expert in infection prevention technology who I've had the good fortune to know for a number of years. One of the original OGs in infection prevention, my friend Ben Favret with VESTEX. Ben, welcome to Clean Talk.
Good to see you, Brad. It's been a long time.
It has been. I really appreciate you doing the show, and what a great platform for the work that you do. You've been at this a long time. We'd love to hear more about your background and what you're doing with VESTEX for infection prevention.
Sure. So I came out of the biotech pharma world. Never really knew anything, in the infection prevention world or apparel for that matter, and was presented an opportunity and kind of seized upon it and started doing a bunch of research on the role that apparel plays in the chain of transmission. And, now it's kind of a known thing. Infection control professionals, the APIC group, now say that clothing is part of the chain of transmission and that it's a virtual conveyor belt for infections. So the world has changed, and we were at the right place at the right time with a great technology that we developed. And I took my medical device pharmaceutical background and applied that to infection prevention technology specific to healthcare worker apparel. And now it's really translated not just to healthcare worker apparel, where we started in 2009, but now it's everyday apparel as well and home goods.
So what makes the VESTEX technology so ideal for healthcare apparel? Tell us a little bit about the technology and why it's important.
Sure. So the VESTEX does three things. First, it repels blood and bodily fluids. That's kind of what we call the first mechanism of action. The second mechanism of action is antimicrobial, a hand sanitizer that we've impregnated into the fiber. And VESTEX is the only apparel that has been able to show in controlled randomized blinded studies published in Infection Control and Hospital Epidemiology done by Gonzalo Bierman and Dick Wenzel, a 4 to 7 log reduction in methicillin-resistant staph on the apparel, both at the beginning of the shift, which is important because you don't want contamination on your clothing going from patient to patient to patient. And then at the end of the shift, which is also important because you ask any nurse what's the first thing she does when she gets home, and she'll say, I strip down in the laundry room or in the garage, streak across the house and take a shower. And if you ask them why, they'll tell you, I know all the nasty stuff that gets on me all day long. So it's kind of the dirty secret of healthcare. And then the third thing VESTEX does is it wicks and breathes, just like the clothes you have on right now. So it's really the combination of those three technologies that we've been able to develop and have cleared by the FDA, and also endorsed by the American Hospital Association along the way.
So I want to definitely dive into that, the FDA and the American Hospital Association endorsement, but I am familiar with the product, and I guess what for our audience who's watching, what makes it special is you can't tell that it's some sort of hydrophobic, specially treated garment. The textile feels like a normal set of scrubs or any kind of normal textile clothing you'd be wearing, and yet it provides these benefits, right? So I think it's important for people to understand that you might not know you were wearing this and that it was special because it feels comfortable like normal cloth.
Exactly. It looks, feels, breathes. I mean, this shirt could be a VESTEX shirt right now. It's not, but actually I should have worn one. But we have dress shirts, we have scrubs, lab coats, jackets, all the common apparel that you wear in the healthcare setting that we originally produced. And now we're working with licensees that are producing kind of the Gore-Tex Intel inside, where VESTEX is now an ingredient brand for these other brands that want, Seal Shield apparel protected by VESTEX.
Well, I told you I want to take you up on that. We love our Seal Shield blue scrubs, but actually I have a VESTEX lab coat. I was looking for it for this podcast. I couldn't find it. I know I have it somewhere. You gave me one about 10 years. That's right.
In New Orleans.
I think it was New Orleans. I think you're right. So I've got to find that somewhere. I was looking for it before the podcast, but I'm going to dig that up. You mentioned the FDA, FDA 510K classification, and that's something I wanted to talk to you about. Can you talk a little bit about the strategy, why you decided to take that route? And I assume, are you the first kind of textile product to get FDA clearance, or was there some precedence there?
So it's a great question. Yes, VESTEX is the first and only product that has ever been approved or cleared, as the FDA calls it, to be able to make specific claims around protecting the wearer from bodily fluids and infectious diseases based on the data that we presented, both in the laboratory as well as in the clinical studies. It's not classified as personal protective equipment. It kind of fills that gap between the non-protective clothing that people wear all day long and PPE, which you'd still wear in a setting where you know you're going to get exposed to something. VESTEX replaces the non-protective clothing, and it's just clothing that has an added layer of protection. But the FDA actually created a whole new product code and category because of the unique performance characteristics of VESTEX, which we were excited about. And it took us a long time. We had to jump through a lot of hoops, but it was well worth the effort. And because of it, we can make claims that no one else can claim. Other antimicrobial apparel can only say that it controls odor. VESTEX can make claims about reducing methicillin-resistant staph and other microbes on the garment, as well as protecting the wearer from intermittent accidental exposures to blood, bodily fluids, and other potentially infectious materials. So there's a lot of things VESTEX can say that's documented and been reviewed by the FDA and the American Hospital Association that allows us to make claims no one else can make about their products.
So obviously that's a huge benefit, but I want to come back to the strategy because I don't think people can appreciate the decision process that went into taking that path. As you mentioned, it had never been done before. Nobody else had ever done it in this category. That's got to be a huge uphill battle, tremendous headwinds. What made you decide to take on that project? And can you talk to us a little bit about that process and any of the pitfalls you faced or challenges in getting to the outcome you wanted there?
Yeah, so there's kind of two reasons why, right? One is the promotional things you want to say and the validation, the clinical credibility you want to have for your product. And that's important. When you're talking to healthcare consumers and people are selling, antimicrobial pens and saying that this is going to prevent infection, let's tap the brakes there. That's just not clinically credible to say bombastic things. I call it the difference between snake oil and science, right? We had a very scientific approach in what we did and how we did it. We developed it as a Class 2 medical device from day one and wanted to say and be able to talk about the performance of the product. So that was one aspect about kind of the sales, marketing, clinical credibility of why we chose to do that, the FDA clearance. The other part is, more of a business decision, and it's about competitively differentiating yourself in the marketplace, but also developing barriers to competitive entry and maximizing the value of the company. The history of all businesses are one or two things. Either you get bought or you go bankrupt. So I didn't want to build the company to go bankrupt. I wanted to build the company to get bought eventually, which we eventually did sell. And then I since have had the opportunity to reacquire the company. But we wanted to maximize the value. And one of the things that investors will pay for is things like patents, FDA clearances, and showing that you have something that's hard to reproduce. And we both have a patent as well as the FDA clearance with VESTEX. So those are things that are just good strategic things you need to do to maximize the value of your business.
Well, I would love to get back to this subject in just a second because I want to talk about those barriers to entry that you're discussing there and get back to the IP piece. But we do have a question from the audience. Randall Rentschler with Artesia General asks, what happens to the antimicrobial with repeated industrial washing? I'm sure it's a question you get a lot.
Yeah.
What's the answer there, Ben?
It's probably the number one question we get, right? So I love telling the story too, because going through the FDA clearance process, the FDA has you validate the performance of the product, not when it's new, but after it's been through whatever you consider the life of the product. The industry standard for apparel is 25 launderings is what they consider the life of the garment. Now, some may last longer, some may get lost the first day. We said we wanted to double that. So we said we want to have data to show effectiveness at 50 launderings. So that was kind of our performance criteria. what we actually found is that the performance of VESTEX lasts much longer than 50. But if you think of lint in your dryer, that's the fiber leaving the garment. And after 50 launderings, you started having more linting. So even after 100 launderings, the performance of VESTEX is always going to be superior to the non-protective clothing that people are wearing today. But what VESTEX allows you to do is, even after 50 launderings, and when I say a laundering, the FDA idea of a laundering was not wash it, dry it, test it. It's stain it with blood, then wash it, then stain it with fecal matter, then wash it, then stain it with sputum, then wash it, and cycle those fluids 50 times. And make sure it doesn't stain and that you still have the antimicrobial and fluid barrier performance and effectiveness, which we did with all the multi-drug resistant organisms, methicillin-resistant staph, Acinetobacter, carbapenem producing Klebsiella, Enterococcus, all the hard to kill organisms. And we still had excellent 2 and 3 log reductions at time 0. So in under a minute, we were getting these very rapid reductions, and they were sustained out for 12 hours. So we're having great effectiveness, and the durability is important, because if the product isn't durable and you don't have that effectiveness out for 50 launderings or more, then the benefit you're getting as both a healthcare worker or the cost benefit of the product isn't there.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned cost. We don't like to lead on price, but how does a garment that's VESTEX protected stack up cost-wise versus a similar garment that doesn't have VESTEX protection?
Right. So the added cost of the technology is a couple dollars, right, at the retail level. So if you had, say, a $20 scrub top, we could produce a VESTEX garment and sell it for, 25, 27, something like that at the retail level, right? That's after,
Right.
the retailer and the manufacturer and all make their money. That's for a high-end, polyrayon spandex fabric. If you took it down to the operating room level, where it's a much less expensive fabric and things like that, it would add, again, a couple dollars to the cost. It isn't like it's, cost prohibitive by any stretch of the imagination.
So let's talk about outside of cost, how this compares to other materials. You have your FDA cleared claims that you've just talked about. What's happening if you're not using VESTEX? What should healthcare workers expect from their standard garments? What are you seeing? I'm sure you've done testing in this area.
Well, I mean, look, there are a lot of reasons why, if you look at the rate of injury and illness in healthcare, it's one of the most, if not the most dangerous place to work in this country. The rate of exposure, colonization, and infection amongst healthcare workers is higher than any other occupation, as you'd expect. They're dealing with sick people. The clothing they're wearing today is non-protective. That's just the reality. It doesn't do anything to protect them. And in fact, what the data conclusively shows, and there's more studies than we can quote, that the clothing is a vector. It acquires, retains, transmits pathogens. So as you're sitting there, and ask any nurse that works in the ER or anywhere else in the hospital. It's happened to me. I've been a patient before, and I've gotten sick and vomited on a nurse before accidentally. This is you're changing a catheter bag and you spill urine on you. I mean, that's just the reality of the job. It's a tough job.
Yeah.
The unexpected is the norm, the splatters, the spills. But the reality is you can't wear PPE 24/7. It's hot, it's uncomfortable, it's inconvenient. And one of the things we learned in the first SARS outbreak is even when people wore PPE, 40% of the time they inoculated themselves or their clothing, and it caused infections. We saw the same thing with Ebola, where 2 people died when they took off their PPE, cross-contaminated themselves, and got Ebola. I'm not saying that VESTEX would necessarily prevent that, but it's always better than the non-protective stuff that people are wearing today. So the question you have is, do I want my clothing to be a carrier and not protect me, or would rather wear something that looks, feels, breathes just the same, except I have an added layer of protection for me, my family, and my patients? And that really is the question that people need to ask themselves.
Right. And I know there are hundreds, if not thousands, of studies on this subject. I remember them identifying the physician's ties as being one of the highest cross contamination points, right? Not if you had a VESTEX tie, right?
Right. Well, the ties, the lab coats, all those things, a lot of times it's because they don't get washed as frequently as they should. The scrubs, we hope people are going to wash them every night, but sometimes they don't. I've worn the same pair of jeans 2 days in a row. I don't wear scrubs, but so people probably do. And one of the things in some of the studies that we did is, what we saw about 40% of the time when a healthcare worker shows up for work, their clothing is already contaminated.
That's interesting.
So either they aren't washing them or, on the subway or, on their way to work, they're running into things. And VESTEX has been proven in multiple studies to reduce the level of contamination on those fabrics. Statistically, I mean, the p-values that we've seen with VESTEX are 0.0002 at the beginning of the shift, 0.0056 at the end of the shift. So these aren't random lucky things. These are highly statistically significant reductions in the level of contamination. 4 to 7 logs. That's 99.99999%. I mean, that's a dramatic effect.
It is. And now, do you have any sense if use of this product has in any way changed the workflow around scrubs? And, do you use less precaution, more precaution, the same precaution? Have there been any changes in workflow that you're aware of?
So I love this question, and here's why. One of the questions we got early on when we were talking to Northwell Health and Mercy Bon Secours and Baptist Health, some of the hospitals that adopted VESTEX, was, well, one of the things we're concerned about is, well, people are wearing VESTEX and they aren't going to wear their PPE or something like that. And actually what we saw is, because we were heightening the awareness and giving people a solution, hand washing compliance rates improved, the use of appropriate use of PPE improved, because it's kind of like wearing your seatbelt, right? When I was a kid, we used to play around on the back of my parents' car and never thought about wearing a seatbelt. Now, I don't get in the car unless I'm wearing a seatbelt. So once you move towards safer practices, and the first step to patient safety is healthcare worker safety, and that's one of the mantras you hear in nurses, in the nursing magnet program. Well, once you make your nurses safer, they don't go backwards. They don't start, you wear a seatbelt, you don't start driving faster or driving more reckless. No, you're more attuned and you're more knowledgeable and aware of the risks that you have. So you actually become safer and protect yourself more. And we've seen this in every hospital where we've adopted, or every hospital that has adopted VESTEX.
Greater awareness leading to better outcomes from greater solutions. I think that's fantastic. Now, I said I did want to come back to this subject of IP. We talked about the strategic initiative of getting the FDA clearance and why that was important from a financial and valuation standpoint. And you also mentioned IP. Tell us a little bit about the IP on this product and kind of your strategic thinking around filing IP on this kind of technology.
So, when we started the company, we had a trade secret. That was our IP. And we licensed 2 patents from a technology partner called Scholler. And then, the studies that we did became another highly difficult in fact, no other apparel has ever been able to show in a controlled randomized blinded study a statistically significant reduction on the contamination on the fabric. So that's a big barrier to entry. The FDA clearance and the American Hospital Association endorsement all become additional barriers. As we developed the technology, we saw some opportunities to develop a patent on both the formulation and application method. And we got that patent earlier, was it earlier this year? Actually, it was end of last year. I think the actual date was like December 27th or 28th, something like that was the actual filing date of the patent that we received from the patent agency. But all of those things are things that you do to add value and make it more difficult for a competitor to come knock off your product and build the clinical credibility of your product. So those were things that we did, again, both for a business perspective to differentiate ourselves in the marketplace and build that clinical credibility, as well as a financial perspective to make it more difficult for competition.
Absolutely. And I want to segue here into the discussion about innovation. And we spoke a little bit earlier. I think all of these things tie in together. You mentioned before, you either get bought or you go bankrupt. And I know you've been through the roller coaster ride of that and dealt with private equity and outside investors. And so the strategies to raise valuation make sense. I've been frustrated, and I've said on this show in the past that one of the problems with healthcare innovation is that there is not a lot of strategic capital coming into innovation, that especially in the infection control space,
right.
There isn't even a category for investing in infection control. There are few, if any, private equity firms that have a portfolio strategy around infection control. And so it is important to increase your valuation to get their attention through things like IP and other barriers to entry, the FDA. But what are your thoughts on this? What, in terms of the state of healthcare innovation, and what can we do to spur more healthcare innovation to help solve this problem of cross-contamination infections?
Yeah. So first off, on the business side, I hear you loud and clear, right? I mean, I think you're onto something there. Infection prevention kind of is in no man's land from an investor's perspective. It's not a therapeutic product. It's not really a medical device. So it kind of falls in no man's land, and people aren't sure how to handle it. A lot of these funds, I always say, finding a financial sponsor or an investor is like finding a spouse. It has to be the right time, the right look, the right education profile, living in the right place. All these factors come into picking your spouse. Well, I've told the story 100 times now. I found an investment fund that, you read their criteria. I talked to the guy. This is a home run. This guy's ready to do the deal. And he says, "You're located in Virginia, aren't you?" I'm like, "No, we're in Florida." He's like, "Oh, the charter of their fund was they only invest in 3 states, Virginia, and I can't remember what the other 2 were." I said, "I would love to do this deal, but I can't." So it can be really challenging from that perspective. And infection prevention falls kind of through the cracks sometimes. So really, it's difficult to find the right types of investors, and dependent upon the stage of the company, right? Look, if you're making millions and millions of dollars, it's easy to find a private equity firm that, just for the revenue stream will invest in you. But when you're starting up, it's a lot more difficult to find the venture capitalist or the angel investors that are willing to and understand infection prevention.
Well, at least it's, I guess the silver lining is we're getting more attention since COVID. COVID has really changed the way people look at infection prevention. And I see capital companies now taking more of an interest. But, this is a problem that can largely be solved with technology that exists today. That if we had the right solution set to address the majority of vectors that cause cross-contamination transmissions, we can make a meaningful, measurable impact. And really calling out to the capital companies to get on the ball and start looking at some of these infection control solutions companies like yours, companies that we're talking to here on Clean Talk. There's a lot of opportunity to solve this problem with the right capital infusion.
Yeah, I totally agree. And the other thing that makes it difficult is people, when you say infection prevention, they define it very narrowly in their minds. And people say infection prevention, they think about preventing infections in patients in a hospital, and they kind of isolate it that way. When the reality is, the broader definition of infection prevention is not only protecting people in the hospital, but protecting the people that care for those people, as well as protecting the community. And COVID has really taught us all 3 phases of that, right? So I think the broader perspective of infection prevention and not so narrowly defining it. I know when we talked about VESTEX from an infection prevention standpoint, we had nothing but resistance. But when we changed the conversation to healthcare worker safety and made it about protecting the doctors and the nurses and the people caring for patients, that's still infection prevention, but it wasn't about preventing an infection in a patient, which is really, really hard to prove. The other thing on innovation that really is difficult in healthcare is healthcare likes to talk about how innovative they are. The reality is healthcare is probably, you look at the Malcolm Baldrige definition of innovation, it's learning to take intelligent risks to get breakthrough results. The problem with healthcare is they want to study the risk out of anything before they ever adopt it. So they are so risk adverse, it really almost precludes them from being innovative. They may have studies that they're doing and stuff like that, but they have to look at the risk of the product versus the potential reward. And if you can have a breakthrough, which is the true definition of, the innovation curve goes, like this, and it's a big jump up. It's not the continuous improvement curve. Well, if you want to make that leapfrog and improvement, you have to be willing to take those intelligent risks. And the way you do that is you say, hey, is this product putting anyone in danger? Is it possible that it could help? And healthcare is so risk adverse. A lot of times the window of opportunity passes them by for the innovation, or the companies die on the vine because healthcare is so risk adverse. And I think healthcare changing their mindset would be a big part of the equation as well, and learning to take intelligent risks and not studying the risk out of everything. Pilot things, do things in control settings more rapidly, and get on the cutting edge and track your results so you can see what's impactful and what is changing behavior, and do more of those things quickly rather than just, it's easy to say no. And that really slows down innovation dramatically.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. Well, of course, I think we can all understand that there is some rationality behind the resistance for innovation. If you make the wrong choice, there can be bad outcomes. We mentioned the lack of capital funding for innovation in the infection control space. And there's huge regulatory headwinds, not just for the innovators, but for the customers, for the healthcare facilities themselves, right?
Right.
They have to make sure that what they're doing is going to be compliant. It's not going to result in some type of catastrophic issue or a financial implication. So there's some rationality behind that behavior.
Yeah,
how do we change that?
That's the whole idea behind intelligent risk, right? It's okay. What are the, look, if it's something that could be a true threat to a patient or a worker, then of course, you want to take more time to study it. But clothing, or in your case, a keyboard, hard to say that that's going to hurt someone, right? A washable keyboard is a pretty innocuous thing that may have an impact. So why not try it, pilot it? Hospitals do pilots all the time with surgical devices and things like that in control settings. So with some of these infection prevention innovations, I think adopting that same mindset of, hey, let's pilot this in this high risk unit or something like that. Or changing the endpoint from, well, everything has to show that it prevents infections. No, it doesn't. Sometimes the outcomes that you're looking for can be surrogate markers of that. And to try to force every product to show that it reduces infection, I think is probably over the top.
You're right. It takes a village, and that's what we've been talking about. There's so many vectors of infection. It's about addressing as many of those vectors as you can to get a meaningful, measurable outcome. And it's very hard to say, oh, that was from the garment. No, it was from the keyboard. No, it might have been from, our new whole room disinfection system. As long as you're getting the results, you've got to address as many of these vectors.
Infection preventionists know this, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
Look, they don't wash just their hands. They spend millions of dollars wiping surfaces in the air filtration, all these things. It's a bundled approach. And incrementally, you want to do more and more things to lower the level of bioburden in the inanimate environment. Anything and everything we can do. The reality is humans are fallible. They're going to miss spots when they, spray and wipe things or whatever it is. So anything we can do to lower the inoculum in the inanimate environment is a step in the right direction. And all it takes is preventing, one or two infections, and you pay for the added cost of some of these technologies. I mean, they really aren't that expensive.
Right. And infections are very expensive.
Right.
Well, Ben, I really appreciate you being on our show today. The science is VESTEX. The company is VESTEX. How can people find out more about this great technology?
Vestex.com. It's real simple. VESTEX.com.
Go to vestex.com to learn more about this great garment technology, or you can contact us here at Seal Shield, sealshield.com, or 1-87-SEAL-SHIELD toll free. My guest today has been Ben Favret with VESTEX. Ben, thanks for being on Clean Talk. Be sure to join us next week live at 3 p.m. on Wednesday, 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Our guest next week will be Phil Jalbert. He's the Seal Shield Canadian Territory Manager. And he's going to talk to us a little bit about what's going on in Canada right now during COVID. It's going to be a great episode. Be sure to tune in then. Until next time, this is Brad Whitchurch reminding you to keep it clean.